And joining us now to discuss why we believe what we believe, Andrew Perrin. He is an associate professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Andrew, as I welcome you to the program, I would think that one would assume that if you were presented with information that contradicts an opinion that you have, you would be more likely to change your opinion. Is that in fact the case?
Well, it's more complicated than that, as you might imagine. Of course, we'd like people to be able to take new information, process it just like maybe a machine, change their opinion when it seems appropriate. But we've known for a long time that that's not really the way most people do their reasoning, whether it's in the political realm or really anywhere else, that people seem to reason in a way that prefers that they not change their opinion unless they really need to.
Let's follow up on that a bit, because you did a study on why people, quote, maintain false beliefs in the face of disconfirming information. Tell us about the study.
That's right. So what we were interested in for this study is we located people who believed something in 2004 that was widely demonstrated to be false, which was that there was a demonstrated link between Saddam Hussein and the terrorists who attacked New York and Washington on September 11th, 2001. And we asked these people, essentially, if this was why they supported the Iraq War. And we selected for further interview those who did, in fact, say that this, number one, was true, and number two, that it was why they supported the war. We then presented them with evidence to show that, in fact, there was no demonstrated link. And in general, they accepted that evidence. So they didn't argue that we were wrong or we were presenting false facts. But they nevertheless maintained their support for the war regardless of the new evidence. And so what we argue about this is that this is evidence that people, in a sense, sometimes reason from the conclusion that they've reached, and essentially what we call backfill. That is, they seek information, seek evidence that they can use to support an argument that they wish to continue to hold. We can't speak to the frequency of this, how often it happens, but we can speak to the fact that this phenomenon exists and is a significant force in people's political reasoning.
Andrew, did you remind these people that even President George W. Bush and even Vice President Richard Cheney acknowledged there was no link between Saddam Hussein and the events of 9/11/01?
Yes, not only did we remind them of that, that was the evidence that we used to convince them. The interesting thing is, it wasn't difficult to convince them. They didn't stay on this piece of information for a long time. They didn't work hard to convince us that we had the wrong information. What they did was simply, by and large, to sort of jump ship and say, well, regardless of that piece of information, there must be a reason. In fact, we titled the article, "There Must Be a Reason," because what they did is they said, look, this is an opinion that I hold. It's what we would call a heuristic. That is, it's an opinion that I hold because I trust the person who's told me about it. And so if the evidence that I was using to support my opinion is wrong, there must just be other evidence that correctly supports that opinion.
Now, some people would look at that and say, that's just foolish. You're a scientist, and obviously you're going to use much more impressive language than that, but what do you call that when, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, people hold on to beliefs that they may have heard from one not particularly credible source?
Well, foolish is, you're right, not a word that I try to use too often. I think this is perhaps an extreme example of what we call motivated reasoning, which is really all forms of reasoning in which people need to be in the right kind of emotional state to try to really accept new information and reason with it all the way through. And so there's a much tighter connection between emotion and the ability to process information than we usually sort of think with. And so, it's easy to say that these folks are foolish, that they're not really paying attention to the information. I think that's kind of too easy of a cop-out. And the reality is that everyone needs to be in a kind of emotional state where, where they're ready to think with new information in a careful and serious way. And one of the things I think that the rest of our research suggests is that the media environment within which these people are reasoning and doing their work is one that generates a kind of emotional state of fear, what we would call in psychology mortality salience, that makes it essentially too scary for them to change their opinions. And so I would say that the sort of next step down the road is, how do we as a democratic society seek to present emotional states that might encourage people to pay attention to the opinions of those with whom they disagree, to consider new information, to pay attention essentially to information from a broader range of sources.
Well, if my television viewing habits of your 24/7 cable channels is any indication, I'm not sure that that's really at the top of their list of things to do, in which case we can presume that there's some kind of contributing factor by 24/7 cable. I want to ask you as well, though, about technology and about online and the plethora of sources that people have to wade through in order to help make their judgments about current events. How does all of that contribute to what you're talking about?
I think it plays a very great role, and there's been some terrific scholarship in the sociology and political science of the mass media recently that's really suggested that we live in a kind of tyranny of choice in terms of information and news. And kind of what that means is that everyone is able to choose a particular news source that they expect already to agree with. And they form essentially what I would call microcultures of people who have a particular set of facts, a particular sort of spin on the facts available to them. And so we've gone from a situation, say, in the 1970s, where if you were watching the news, you were watching one of 3 primetime broadcast television news channels. And so you had access to the same facts, the same ideas, the same points of view as everyone else, and you had a sort of common basis for understanding and arguing and discussing matters. It's ironic that the information technology environment that we have now presents an incredible array of choices of where and how to get your news and in what size bites and what kind of media and with what kind of political spin. And we love to say that choice is good, and in most cases choice is good, but consumers of those media are unable really to evaluate how correct they are, to what extent they're presenting information that's either from opposing viewpoints or is well verified. And so this kind of fragmentation of the media audience, I think, is a big problem and a piece of the puzzle.
I was going to follow up on that presentation aspect of it because, of course, 30, 40 years ago, when you're talking about the days of, Walter Cronkite, Hundley Brinkley, that kind of thing, the news may have been, presented pretty much in the same way. It's completely different now, isn't it? You've got everything from Rush Limbaugh out there to Rachel Maddow, from right to left, trying to, as you say, put a bit of a spin on the day's events. Does that make it more complicated for people to try to figure out what's actually going on?
It certainly does make it more complicated. But, I think when you talk about people like Rush Limbaugh, like Rachel Maddow, these are people who are clearly labeled as opinion leaders, and the folks who are listening to them listen to them as a political community. They believe that this is the spin they want to hear. So frankly, I'm less worried about that than I am about the fragmentation of the news and information audience, because these are people who are being essentially targeted as a commercial audience, and yet they don't know how best to evaluate the material that's being presented as simply true, as fact, if you will. So the political scientist at Princeton, Marcus Pryor, has done some terrific work demonstrating that it really is the fragmentation of this cable news audience that produces people's essentially less good knowledge of the political world, precisely because they get to go out and choose their news instead of having it presented to them. And so in a sense, it's I used to joke that news station in Philadelphia I used to listen to always talked about, well, where you're our focus. Well, but you don't listen to news to be the focus of the news. You already know what's going on with you. The point ought to be where the rest of the world is the focus, and that's what's been lost in this kind of media environment.
Well, I suspect, let's take the two poles here. We know that Fox Television on the one side, and then there's MSNBC on the other side. And I suspect my viewers want me to ask you, is there one particular ideology that is more apt to ignore fact and contradicting information and stick to their beliefs regardless of what information is out there, the Fox viewer or the MSNBC viewer?
That's not a horse I'm going to buy, but you know, the reality is that everyone engages in motivated reasoning. One of the kinds of motivations you can have is motivation to reason with fact. But everybody engages in motivated reasoning. Everybody's trying to be the kind of citizen that they believe is correct. So it's not as simple or as straightforward as any of that. Now, there are some interesting studies that demonstrate that that compare essentially right-wing talk radio with left-wing talk radio, and demonstrate that more frequently left-wing talk radio tends to pay attention to fact as part of its argument. You know, I think that, you know, the reality is that in both of these cases, these are attempts to sort of convince an audience of a particular position. You know, I don't have evidence or research to suggest that either one is more purely fact. They're both presenting facts in ways that that sort of fit the bill. Now, that said, on some of these sort of fact-check type organizations, it appears to be the case that the right-wing media are more frequently at fault for distorting some of those facts than are the left-wing media in general.
Now, you know what they're going to say in the right-wing media world, though. They're going to say, here's this university professor, pointy-headed academic from some left-wing university, yada, 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 who's reinforcing every stereotype. Right. So you want to hit that one?
Sure, I'll be happy to hit that one. You know, I have no dog in this fight. I really don't. What I study is democratic deliberation. I seek to take positions that I think match the evidence. In fact, I think the wonderful thing about academia is that we get to pay attention to the evidence and really care deeply about it. So, you know, I know that's a common stereotype. You know, the reality is that there are times when I've taken conservative positions. There are times when I've taken what we in the States call liberal positions or left positions up there in Canada. You know, my view here in terms of paying attention to the deliberative environment within which citizens work is I care about, do they have access to serious competing viewpoints that they can pay attention to, and are they put in emotional states that make it more likely that they will pay attention to those views than that they will seek only to rebut them. And so those are the concerns that I have.
Okay, Andrew, in our last couple of minutes, let's finish up on this. Is it just a ridiculous notion that in this 24/7 cable TV world in which we live, we are well past the point where we can expect to have a rational conversation free from the kind of off-the-charts appeals to the emotion, and rather just, you know, kind of do something old-fashioned, like look at the facts, if we're trying to have a national debate about things?
You know, if you'll forgive me, I think that's just the wrong question to ask. Not only are we not past that point, we've never been at that point. You know, the truth is, it has always been the case, and it will always be the case, that people reason with facts that are mixed in with what they want to believe, what their friends believe, what they think is right and wrong, and how they're feeling. So emotions and opinions and facts can't be so cleanly separated as we'd like to think that they can be, or as your question presumes they can be. You know, the real question, to my mind, is not when can we reason just with facts, because honestly, in a democracy, questions of right and wrong, questions of anger or sadness or fear or joy or excitement, those are all perfectly reasonable pieces of a democracy. The question is, when can we and how can we put people in a state where they're willing to pay attention to the cases and ideas and views of those who disagree with them, so that other packages of facts and opinions and emotions can be more seriously considered across the board.
And how do you propose we do that?
Well, I think, I mentioned briefly mortality salience before, and I think that's a big piece of what was going on with our respondents in this study. When you get people scared, when you tell them, you're going to lose your health care, you're going to lose your doctor, you're even potentially going to lose your life, as I think, some political actors seek to mobilize that kind of fear. Being in a state of fear is not a good emotional state to be in, to be willing to pay attention to the views of others, to pay attention to new facts or new contradictory information. Feeling safe in one's person and one's body, feeling that one's family and community are safe, those are the kinds of feelings that make people more willing to then consider interesting and different points of view and to do so in a more faithful way. So, my view is that if I had to ask politicians across the board to do something, it would be, please tone down the fear, tone down the world is ending rhetoric, and let's pay more attention to, look, we have lots of opportunities here. We can go in lots of different directions. Let's have a strong, serious national conversation about which of those directions, really fits our ideals, our views of right and wrong, and our opinions and the facts.
Seems to me the last one of your presidents that argued we have nothing to fear but fear itself did pretty well. So maybe they should listen to what you've got to say. Thanks so much, Andrew Perrin.
I think that's right.
Professor of Sociology, University of North Carolina. Thanks for joining us on the line from Chapel Hill. It's good to talk to you.